Welcome to Fat Chicks on Top. This podcast contains frank discussions about the body, sexuality, and occasionally uses swear words, which may not be appropriate for people under the age of 18. This podcast also uses facts, statistics, and mathematics, which may not be appropriate for liberal arts majors. And this podcast relies on science and reality, which may not be appropriate for evangelicals. Welcome to Fat Chicks on Top. You are here with your host, Auntie Vice, and we're back. I'm sorry for the extended pause, but for those of you who've been following my writings, it's health stuff cleared up. So I am back, and while I had others recorded, I got the phenomenal Julia Serano on my show, and she agreed to come out, and it's the perfect one to kick off the new season with. For those of you who are not familiar with her, she's a trans activist, a musician, slam poetry championship, and most importantly, a writer. Her first book, Whipping Girl, is now in its third edition, which is huge for a book like that. Then she had Excluded, and now she has Sexed Up. And I've read most of the way through Sexed Up. I've read the other two. Love her writing. She does a Substack. She does a
Hello, thanks for
blog.
having me.
Welcome
Happy
to the
to
show.
be here.
With all of the fuckery of the world, how
Yes, I feel
are
like
you holding
it's the
up? How are you
qualifier. So when
doing?
people ask me, I'm usually like relatively okay or doing okay, all things considered. So I'm personally right now doing okay as a human being amidst, us being the This Is Fine dog in the cartoon in our lives every day. So
Yes. When you started writing about trans activism, because your
mhm,
your academic background is biology, and evolutionary biology. So when you actually started writing about trans issues, did you think it would ever become this much of
never.
a public discussion?
Never once did I ever think, something I've been thinking a lot to, like, the zeros, which is the decade, I transitioned in 2001, and then I became kind of active in trans communities and
Mhm.
activism, like, throughout the zeros, and then wrote Whipping Girl, and, which was published in 2007. So during that period of time, I've been thinking a lot about it just because of the time we're living through, and it was a very hard time to be a trans person, in some ways harder than it is now, in that especially a lot of people had no idea about anything, and so sometimes I would tell people I was trans, and they're like, "What?" I'm like, "I'm transgender." "What?" "I'm a transsexual." "What?" "I used to be a man, but now I'm a woman." Like, literally people had no idea, and, but there was a certain amount of peace that I did not realize at the time, that I could come home and I could watch TV and so forth. And with very few, like, occasional walk-on trans characters, there's, like, literally nothing about us. And now I feel like every day I wake up and there's, like, 5 different news stories related to whether they're blown out of proportion trans stuff, whether it's the anti-trans legislation, whether it's things like the Amelia Perez movie, which is a whole Pandora's box of stuff I don't necessarily need to get into. Just I feel like it's, like, everywhere all the time, and some days I just wish, like, can I just turn off the trans faucet for, like, a day or 2 and, like, concentrate on other stuff? Yeah.
I love that you bring it up because there's a lot of talk about need for representation, for people to see themselves and reflected back to them, and I came out as gender nonconforming in the '90s, and, like, the only real big discussion around it was the Michigan Women's Music
Yeah.
Festival and whether or not to include trans women. But yeah, people real and I don't think younger generations know how advanced we've gotten in it. how much so there's all this discussion, but do you feel like there's really representation of the trans community in a lot of that, or is it more cis
Yeah,
folks talking
I
about
think it
trans
shifted.
folks?
So there was in the 2010s, we had the transgender tipping point, and a lot of people like to mock that for somewhat understandable reasons, like, "Oh, it's the transgender tipping point, we're here." And literally in my writings,
Mhm.
2015, the year after the transgender tipping point, is when the current anti-trans backlash really started getting going and started to coalesce. But, during that period of time in the 2010s was a rare it was sort of like a media phenomenon where a lot of media companies felt like, "Oh, we're behind on this whole trans thing. Like, let's hire a trans person to, like, write something about us." And I started that was the one period of time where I was getting a lot of unsolicited, um, writing requests, like, "Hey, would you consider writing for our publication, like an essay about trans people or what's going on right now?" And so I think for a period of time in the 2010s, there were a lot of trans people talking about trans people and issues. But then as the backlash went on, a lot of those, there's like a purging of trans writers and journalists from mainstream publications. We're still out there. We're writing on our own. We're doing independent stuff, or we're with like smaller, especially like there are a lot of trans people writing for LGBTQ plus type of outlets. But like the mainstream stuff, it's just all of them talking about us now. And I think there's a small period of time where that seemed to be shifting, but it was temporary.
So with that, and one of the big focuses, and there's been a couple of really good essays come out about how much the New York Times, the publication of note in the US, is anti-trans. And that wasn't always as apparent. Um, when you see that shift in the papers and you get all this deluge of people talking about your identity, what does that do for like
Yeah.
basic mental health and
um,
survival?
yeah, no, I just feel like it's constantly, like, mentally tiring or exhausting. A lot of the writing that I do is I sometimes joke that it's, trans and LGBTQ and feminism, like, 201 or 301 level stuff rather than 101 level stuff. So, for the stuff that I'm working on, it doesn't really have bearing on me, but it is very exhausting every day to be like, "Oh, there's this new thing," and everybody feels like they have to react to it. Whether it's and lately, over the last several years, it's been a lot of New York Times articles, or whether, it's, transvestigating Olympic boxers, or whether like, I just feel like almost every day, every week, there's, like, several different stories, and sometimes I'll respond immediately to them, but I try to just, like, maybe put out I used to say tweets, but, like, now I'm on Blue Sky, so I guess they are skeets. They're calling them on the Blue Sky. I'll react there, like a couple small little posts. I try not to get sucked
Mhm.
into all that. I try to focus on, uh, trying to write more, cohesive, thoughtful, comprehensive responses to issues that are happening rather than reacting every day to every little micro trans story, if that makes sense, yeah.
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 No, because there's just too much. There's too much. So I wanna get into some of your writings. You talk a lot across multiple writings
Mhm.
about, double standards, and this administration probably most exemplifies double standards in a way that I haven't seen any other political administration embrace them. So let's just start by talking about when you talk about double standards, kind of get the basis so that people who are not familiar with the work and stuff and may have just heard the word in
Sure,
passing,
yeah. So,
what we're actually talking
um,
about.
a lot of particularly when I was working on Whipping Girl, I was noticing a lot of so I was critiquing mainstream views of trans people. But then, like, within certain, like, either feminist or LGBTQ, like, subcircles, or even within the trans community, there would often be kind of debates, sometimes particularly marginalizing trans women, sometimes marginalizing transsexuals, which is a word that is making a comeback yet again. I feel like it's a cyclical world of people, basically people who transition, as opposed to some trans people don't transition or are non-binary. Some people are both non-binary and transsexual. It's very complicated, but sometimes there are these critiques that come up within smaller subcircles, sometimes activist space or other community spaces. And so it was hard. And sometimes they will come to differing conclusions. They might not like trans people, but for different reasons than the mainstream doesn't like trans people. And so I found myself in working on all that, it's hard to draw an overarching theory that addresses both mainstream ideas about trans people and also kind of these weird, smaller esoteric, for instance, nowadays we call it like gender critical or turf. Like they have a lot of ideas that don't fit mainstream ideas about trans people, but that they push those ideas. And so I started thinking more in terms of the way in which we create double standards. Um, and I felt like double standard was a good way of putting it because, like, if when you're 6 years old, you don't know a whole lot about the world, but you know that, like, "Hey, you're treating me this way and that person this way," that's fair, that's a double standard, right? So it's very basic, and especially the idea that I think it's useful for us to understand how double standards work. And that way, if we're in our own like feminist community or queer community or whatever sub community we're in, and if you see people being treated differently, um, even if you don't know what ism is driving that, you can maybe start to like recognize, oh, wait, we're treating two different groups in different ways. And so I first started talking about double standards, particularly in my book Excluded, and I do that in a lot of that work I extend in Sexed Up. Um, and one very useful way, there are different ways you can think about double standards. The one that I appreciate the most is what's sometimes called markedness. And I often refer to it as the unmarked versus marked mindset or dichotomy. And this is just this basic idea that seems to organize a lot of human thought, where some things seem normal to us, they seem taken for granted. If you're walking down the street and you see someone with brown hair, you will not think twice about that because that's just something that we accept that some people have brown hair. But some people or some things will jump out at us. And so, as opposed to being unmarked, like brown hair, some things are marked. So, if someone has pink hair, that might jump out at you. Like they're across the street and all of a sudden, like they catch your glance, right? And and when things are marked to us, we tend to view them as remarkable, um, and we tend to have a lot of questions about like, why did that happen? Why did that person exist? And that leads us to question them and to often view them as suspect, often to view them as artificial, where some things we imagine to be natural. And so basically, a lot of these ideas are really built into not only like how we view hair colors walking down the street, but how we view some groups of people versus others. So, in our culture, if you're trans, you're marked, where if you're cisgender, you're not marked, you're unmarked. But if you're white, you're unmarked in our society. But if you're a person of color, you're marked. Women tend to be marked relative to men. But once you understand these aspects where people who we tend to mark, we view them as we scrutinize them more, we give them undue attention, we question them, we view them as suspect and artificial. Once you realize that, you see a lot of these same problems coming up over and over again with different forms of marginalization.
And I love that that's the way you describe it, and when you begin say step, you talk about height. And I am built like a linebacker. I'm a little over 6 feet tall and, like, 270 pounds. So, I get a lot of attention just being out in public, and it was such an easy one for me to grasp,
Mhm.
being tall, because there's an automatic question, and it doesn't matter what space I'm in, it's
Yeah.
just that I grew tall. I come from a tall family. Um, but there's a lot of assumptions around what I'll be like, how I am to interact with just with that. So I think that's a great way to illustrate marked versus unmarked for a trait that doesn't really mean anything. Then I
Mhm.
just had really tall parents. Um, and so now there's a question coming up of, you know, transness is marked, queerness can be marked, or unmarked. Like there are people who clearly blend in and pass and don't draw that attention. And whether or not with the pushback, there's that need to become more marked and more visible. And you do talk about the dichotomies that come up with that, right? And so let's talk a little bit about as you watch this backlash from this administration for the second time, um, where what should people consider when they're deciding how to
Yeah,
present in the
so
world?
yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, and there's a lot that kind of is infused in that.
Mhm,
Um, and I think all of us are
mhm,
sometimes we don't have any control over whether or not we're marked or not. Like you were talking about size, that's something that, we generally don't get to choose how tall we are or how big versus small we are. Um, and I think in the case of trans people, there's also issues about some people tend to pass as cisgender while other people, trans people, do not pass as cisgender. And that often has little to do with how we decide to dress ourselves that day or whatever. Like, there are a lot of other factors that can go into that. Um, and I think that sometimes uh there's obviously some safety involved if you pass as the unmarked group, just whatever that is in culture. Like, the more
mhm,
unmarked you are, the more you can walk down the street and nobody bothers you. Um, Whereas some of us are different and we like to express the fact that we're different, or whether that's just out of a personal sense of style, or whether it's like a big like F you to the society at large. Um, and so I think there are a lot of different decisions, many different types of thoughts and decisions that can go into whether or not how we decide to move through the world. I don't think that we need to all, purposefully, make it so that our style makes it so that we are marked in society. I think it's fine to like aesthetically, you know, if you like your brown hair, to, like, keep your hair brown. Like, I don't think we necessarily have to, like, constantly visually not enforce the fact, but, express the fact that we are like, "Hey, I'm queer, and you should know that." But sometimes it's fine to do that, or if that's just how you express yourself, that's fine too. Um, I think it's important. I talk about this a lot in Excluded. I talk about the double binds that come from this. And I think it's important not to like create hierarchies about it, because uh, these things are double binds, right? So if I am moving through the world and people are reading me as cisgender, there's some safety that comes with it. But it also can be potentially difficult or dangerous if, for example, people ask me, "Oh, like, were you in Girl Scouts when you were a kid?" Like, this is something that happened to me multiple times in real life, where I'm like working, and the person I'm working with doesn't know I'm trans, and they'll ask me something about my imagined girlhood. I'm like, "No, I wasn't," and they're like, "Oh, why?" And it's like, "Well, because I was in Boy Scouts." I don't know, like and then so that's a double bind, in that all of a sudden you have to out yourself and then you open yourself up to that. Whereas if you're out to begin with, you don't have to deal with those questions, but you might deal with undue scrutiny or harassment because of that. So I think it's important not to recognize that these are double binds because we are marked, and not to um, create hierarchies out of them unnecessarily. Like, I think that we are diverse people, whether that's queerness or whether that's, you know, any other form of ways in which people in the world are. Like, queer people are very diverse, and we're each going to do our own thing. And it's bad when people do like respectability politics and they're like, well, I'm a better queer person because I'm more respectable, where the people over there with the blue hair, those are the people who are hurting our movement. Like, that's messed up. That's bad. Respectability politics are very bad. Um, so But at the same time, I don't think that there's a problem with the fact that some people who are queer strike kind of the straight, cisgender, um, dominant majority as relatively normal relative to others. Like, I don't think one is better than the other, but all of our lives are complicated by the fact that we're marked.
So you bring up respectability politics, and this has always
Mhm.
been something that has chafed me as somebody who's never been able to be unmarked in the queer community. For listeners who may not be familiar, respectability politics is the idea that we can be respectable enough, we can blend in, we can be enough like the dominant majority to be safe and to get our rights, and then we'll pull up everybody else behind us. Um, you were involved in a lot of the early discussions around specifically trans women and whether or not we should embrace them, whereas trans men kind of got ignored. Do you see that as falling into the respect of like, are trans men necessarily more respectable,
Yeah,
or
so I
why are
think
we
that
ignoring our trans men?
and I think there's several elements to this. And so like people will often talk about like trans mal or trans masculine invisibility. And I think part of it is so one of the arguments that I made in Whipping Girl is that um there's the intersection of, being trans is marked relative to being cis. And being female and feminine in our culture is marked relative to being male or masculine. And so I think, like, trans women are doubly marked, and because of that, we tend to get, like, a lot of extra, scrutiny and attention, and often we're viewed as especially suspect, especially artificial, and so I think that's why there's a lot of mainstream attention on us and less on people who are trans male or trans masculine. I think also some of it can be related to, um so uh, people who have studied gender cues, like, and to figure out, like, well, how do we decide when we see someone whether someone's a man or a woman? And there have been these studies about it, especially like the Kessler and McKenna book, um, uh, Gender and Ethnomethodology, was a famous book that was one of the early books that looked into it. But we tend to notice male cues tend to dominate for us over female cues. um, and I think because of that, there tends to be a tendency to, like, um I think for trans women who've had a male puberty and transition, a lot of times when people so-called clock us, or read us as trans, it's often because they're picking up on those male or masculine cues. Whereas I think a lot of times trans men, if they have enough male or masculine cues, are not recognized. They're just recognized as men. And so I think that there's multiple aspects there. So I think some of it is the idea of like, trans misogyny focuses on trans women and trans male invisibility is the flip side of that coin of not being noticed. But then I think there might also be visual cues that lead people to not necessarily see trans men as trans as much. Um, and I think there are other possible elements that are involved in that. Um, but it does again, it creates like just because you're invisible or you're visible, like neither of them is necessarily a good thing. Like if you are a very visibly trans person, you can get extra scrutiny and harassment. If you're invisible, then, there's less attention paid to you, which in some contexts may be good, but then there may be less understanding about who you are, right? And so I, trans masculine and trans male people in my life will sometimes talk about how they've had to explain to people that they're trans because the person they're explaining it to only ever thinks of trans women when they think of trans, like, they didn't even know that there were some people who transitioned in the other direction or who transgressed gender in the other direction. So, yeah, that's a definitely a very an extra complication amongst all these other complications.
So yeah, you bring up trans male invisibility, and there's a lot of that. And the political conversation has focused almost
Mhm.
exclusively on trans women, right? We don't hear pushback against trans men at all. So there,
Yeah.
that adds a complication in this within the trans community because of that difference between trans men and trans women. When you come together with community, how does that affect relations within the trans world? Like when you're just with
Yeah. So I will say, so for the longest time, there was, and particularly when I was writing like Whipping Girl back in the zeros, there was like an extreme amount of like trans male invisibility. I think there's an increased recognition along with the fact that more people know about trans people. I also think that I think there's the media and what the media tells us, but then there's the reality that like 40, I think
Mhm.
it's like 42% of Americans say that they know someone who's trans. And so like probably about half those people like know a trans male or trans masculine person, right? So the visibility is definitely true of the media and maybe less true of that. There's also, I should say that in the last like 6 years or so, there has been one of the anti-trans narratives is about, um, young girls, and I'm putting quotes around young girls because these are trans masculine, um, youth
Mhm.
who, are being, like, seduced by transgender ideology, right? And there's been an increasing recognition there, but again, it's also, like, under the idea of, like, playing on a lot of misogynistic tropes about how girls and women are like, easily misled, and also getting into creepy tones of like the idea that they are seduced and like, so like transgender is like a perverted man who's seducing all the young girls. It's just this really messed up narrative that so there has been a little increasing recognition of the fact that they're trans male and trans masculine people, although a lot of times that gets, um, distorted into this, you know, this anti-trans narrative that exists. Um, so I wanted to say that, and now I've forgotten, the actual thing you asked me that I was going to address.
Oh, about trans male invisibility, and when you get together in community with other trans folks. Yeah.
There exists online, some, trans masc versus trans femme discourses that are sometimes heated, and I see people reacting to them a lot. In my own life, I think that, I'm in a community where there are trans masculine and trans feminine people, there are transsexuals and non-binary people, and it's a whole mix of people, and I think there's definitely a sense in my own life with other trans people I know across all those spectrums that we're kind of all in this really messed up situation together. Um, and I don't, as a general rule, I think all of us understand that it's complicated. Being trans is complicated in all these different ways. But then there are a lot of times, especially online, a lot of times things get very simplified into say who has privilege and who doesn't have privilege, or who is oppressed and who is not oppressed. And so sometimes those things play out in um, unfortunately simplistic ways. So I'm not saying that like, we all get along hunky dory all the time, or that, um,
Mhm.
but I think most of us recognize that we're all part of the same community. And as a general rule, when our executive branch of government is trying to erase us or eradicate us, that affects all of us, and we're all in this together.
Yeah, it's been interesting.
Mhm.
So I'm up in Grass Valley in Northern California, small mountain town, and what's been surprising is I've been up here for 6 years, and when I moved up here, there was no trans visibility, and now I run a monthly queer meetup, and we have more than a dozen trans folks who come out and just come into community. And it's become a lot more visible, even in smaller conservative communities like ours. But that creates then
Mhm.
targets, right? Because we have a lot, like you drive up here and it's all Trump signs, rah, rah, rah. Like the joke is the way you give directions up here is you pass three Trump signs, and if you've hit the Confederate
Yeah.
flag, you've gone too far. So, with that, how do we create protection for trans folks out in public? Just whether or not you're part of the LGBTQ plus community or in general, what are some of the ways people can create safer spaces and
Yeah, sure,
protect our
yeah. No,
trans
that's really
folks?
tough, and especially, like, at this particular time. I mean, I think one way, so especially if you are not trans yourself, just being very vocally and not just, like, pro-trans or waving trans flags, but, uh, countering people if people are expressing anti-trans views, like, even just the so especially since a lot of the anti-trans, sentiments that are happening are being generated on websites and on Fox News, and so some people are just being spoon-fed anti-trans propaganda all the time. And so sometimes even countering, not necessarily telling someone they're transphobic because of their views, but sometimes just countering, it's like, "Well, I know a couple trans people, and the things you're saying is absolutely wrong about them. You know, they're just people." Like, even something like that can, like, trip people up, make them maybe think twice about it. Again, I don't if someone's a really diehard anti-trans activist who's committing their life to, like, ruining the lives of trans people, I don't know that you'll get to them, but I think that there are a lot of people who all of this anti-trans propaganda is swirling around, and so maybe they're accepting some of what Fox News and politicians are saying, and if you just counter it and say, "Actually, all that's wrong." You know, like, "Oh, like, a friend of mine has a trans child, and, that they're doing really well, and they were, like, doing horrible before people started, recognizing their gender, and now they're doing really great. Like, what's wrong with that?" Um, like, little interventions like that, I think, can make a really big deal for some people as far as maybe pushing them one way or another. So, that's definitely, um I mean, that's definitely one way to potentially do it. I do know that, um, in trans communities, I think there's a lot more I've seen a lot more trying to, kind of building in safety into, like, meeting up. So, going way back in my first trans, uh, experiences with trans community was in 1994, and I joined a trans group that was called Crossdressers and Friends. It was, like, for any trans people or
Mhm.
partners, etcetera. And, when we met, like, you were vetted, like, the first you had a phone interview, and then if you seemed, like, legitimately trans, then you would have an in-person interview one-on-one with someone from the group, just to make sure that you were trans, and while things have not gotten that bad now, I do know that a lot of trans groups are, um, you know, rather than, like, putting up posters everywhere, like, "Come to our trans event," or, like, more through different channels, some people using things like Discord or Slack or, um, more, uh, private channels that you have to be invited to. I know people are, um kind of building in a little bit of safety, in that way too, which, can sometimes be it's a shame that that has to happen, but that's another way to a layer of protection where, just some random person who hates trans people doesn't decide to barge in. Um, so yeah, so those are like a couple ideas. I'm sure that, uh yeah, with more time, I could think of more, but those are the first couple that came off top of my head, so, yeah.
Those are great. And for our listeners, if you're looking for Discord channels that are inviting, I'm a member of a number of them, and I'll post links where you can get vetted, depending on what you're interested in. Because there are some amazing Discord channels that are creating community, uh, including one I run up here. So for local folks, but I've got a bunch I'll list in the show notes. So right now, where are you finding the the moments of joy and support? Because you gotta find those to keep going, because otherwise it's horrible out there.
Yeah, I mean, mostly like in my local community and particularly like uh in my particular friend circle, there's a lot of going to queer karaoke. Which is good. I mean, it's a place I have like friends who routinely go to these events, and so I'll see people that I know and I'll see people who I haven't met yet. And just the fact that it's centered on something like singing that um you know that you can do or not do. You don't have to sing to go to queer karaoke. But the fact that it's has nothing to do with uh you know kind of the current situation. It's just like, let's just go and hang out and sing songs. Uh, that can be fun, and I'm sure that whatever, types of different, uh, subcultures that you're interested in, I'm sure there are trans and queer subgroups, that kind of meet, or get together along those particular lines. So, that can be definitely, um, something like that is, for me, what I've been doing, so
You are a musician, you've been in a couple of bands, toured, all of that. Did you watch the Grammys?
I did not. So, yeah, I missed them,
Did you
so
Yeah. I was gonna say, because there was a lot of representation of non-binary and queer
mhm.
artists. Um, are you finding musicians that you're just absolutely in love with right now?
That's a good question. I haven't been listening to like, I hear music. I haven't been, like, delving into music the way that I used to. Like, there was a period of time where music was my main creative outlet. Um, and, so so sometimes it's just like I'll pick stuff up. Occasionally, like, my partner, I will pick up a album of somebody. Um, we were listening to the Chapel Roan one a lot, like, late last year. I don't have a particular thing that I've been listening to, most recently. It is really amazing how many, queer and trans and non-binary artists there are, which again, I think also is something that is useful to think of during these difficult times because 'cause they're trying to, like, erase us or eradicate us, and we're, like, about, you know, like, somewhere close to 1% of the population, and particularly the younger you go, there's more people larger proportion of the generation is kind of out as trans or LGBTQ or non-binary, um, and so I feel that there's a certain amount of you can't put the genie back into the bottle, like, they can really do a lot to try to make our lives difficult and horrible, but they can't make us disappear because we randomly pop up in families and communities regardless of, what the laws are or, how they're likely to treat us. So, I think that watching, especially whatever the laws are when there are, like, trans people, putting out music and, writing books, and especially because I'm a writer, I'm around, like, a lot of I follow people on social media who are younger trans people, they're putting out books and everything. It's
Mhm.
just, like, really amazing how many, trans books there are. Um, in the early zeros when I first transitioned and when I was working on Whipping Girl, I sometimes joked that I felt like I'd read almost every single trans-related book that there was, and nowadays, I couldn't even begin to scratch the surface of it, which is really amazing and exciting, and yeah, so I don't think they can put us back in the bottle, the proverbial bottle, as they say.
Yeah. I feel the same way with trans literature, 'cause when I started exploring my own identity, and that was like 1989. Like there were like 6 books, and now there's so many. It's so wonderful. Um, Speaking of the younger generation, you also identify as
Mhm.
bisexual. And so I know when I came out in the late '80s, bisexual was the smallest group in the LGBT, like, we had to fight to get the B in. I remember going to national meetings fighting to get the B in. And now it's the largest population, in the queer community. Do you have any insight on why that changed and why there's so many more people identifying somewhere in that I mean, there's lots of letters that now they have different identities, and not everybody goes for bi, but within that multi-sexual attraction group.
Sure, yeah, and um I think that there may be connections here that I'll try to explain, between the rise of, uh, bisexual people and the rise of people coming out as non-binary. I'll explain that in a second. I think that I remember being in the '80s and '90s, and if you were talking about what percent of the population was gay, like, a lot of times it was just, like, gay, like, that it was just that was the only one. Um, and, people would often bring up there was the Kinsey report, which I think suggested that, like, 10% were, and then you do other, like, surveys, and it was only 1 or 2%, and so people are like, "Well, what's going on there?" But then if you did other surveys and you're like, "Have you ever, um, like, had, like, a singular, same-sex relationship or experience?" Like, that number was way higher, like, sometimes according to some things, like, 20% of people had. And once you realize that, it's like, okay, well, maybe particularly in the like 1980s, which is a very difficult time, especially with AIDS, like um, the existing homophobia with AIDS on top of that, like leading to even more demonization. Like, if 1 or 2% of people were like identifying as gay, but 20% of people would admit on a survey that they had a same sex relationship, it's like, well, a lot of the maybe the really, really committed people who just like, "There's no way I can hide this, there's no way, um, I can't go through life pretending I'm straight." So maybe there's, like, the people who are the more, I don't wanna say committed, I'm trying to find a word that isn't,
Mhm.
hierarchical, but, like, the people who were, like, absolutely 100%, "I'm only attracted to the same sex." If those were the people who were out and identifying as gay, and then there are a lot of people who had same-sex relationships, but maybe also had, hetero relationships, and it was easier for them to kind of blend in because of the fact that they had hetero relationships. That suggests that maybe there's a lot of bisexual people who didn't feel safe coming out. And as a general rule back then, like in the '80s and '90s, and as a trans person in the '90s, as I was exploring my gender, I mean, I resisted publicly coming out for a very long time until I kind of reached the point where I felt like I couldn't hide that anymore. Um, and so all of a sudden, if you're growing up in a world where it's okay to be trans to a certain extent, then you're more likely to come out as trans. And so there might be rising numbers, a rising increase in the percentage of people coming out of trans. And then if you're someone who feels like, well, I never really the gender that I was assigned, it never really meshed with me, and I don't necessarily want to transition, but, oh, now I can be non-binary. It's kind of like a similar thing that it's some safe space for people who maybe don't fit neatly into, you know, the male-female binary, but, maybe didn't have a strong feeling that they should be the other gender. And so I think part of this is the progress that we've made as a community in making it okay that your sexual orientation or your gender identity, that's yours, and it shouldn't matter, and people shouldn't, prevent you from being that, they shouldn't police that. That creates a world where there's a lot more possibilities. So, that's kind of my thinking about that with regards to bisexual, but also, kind of the increase in people, identifying as non-binary.
Well, and you've written a lot about, uh, the fact that we have, like, these filing cabinets, right? And we create these binaries, and you're in one filing cabinet or the other, and there's a judgment on it. And we're finally getting to a point culturally where we're recognizing there's a lot in between,
Yeah.
right? There's more than just the binary, and it's much more complicated. Um, but we also have reduced the discussion online to these little simple tidbits. So, how do you manage going between wanting to have a significant conversation about these things versus what sound bites we all get reduced to, and the fact that most people won't read more than 500 words at a time?
Yeah, I mean, that can be hard. I mean, I definitely think that there's 2 things. I think one is, uh, just having a lack of, you know, only having so many words in a post online, it's going to make people simplify things, and that becomes a problem not just for, like, talking about our identities, like politics. I've seen so many things where people will reduce to, like, a really complex political argument into, like, one side or the other. It's like, well, actually, there are a lot of different facets to that particular debate. So I think that that's, like, a social media problem more generally. I definitely also think that there is, a gravity in discussions about any kind of diversity that happens toward a gravity towards an identity politics where you like it's important for you to say like where you stand on that particular issue, and then that can tend to simplify a lot of the debates we have about it. Um, and So yeah, so that can be like, well, sometimes I'll refer to myself as a trans person because like that's relevant to the thing that I'm talking about. Um, but the fact that I kind of even have to do that kind of, you know, It the fact that I have to say the fact that I'm trans in order to get across the things I'm saying, and then people might misinterpret the fact that I'm saying that as, "Oh, that's the trans position," but then I'm a trans person, I disagree with that position, and it just it life is a way more complicated than just reducing people down to their identities, but sometimes, and especially online and especially in certain conversations, uh, that will come up and that can kind of oversimplify things too. I try in my writings, particularly my books and essays, I try to be judicious and thoughtful in how I'm uh, trying to convey like whatever it is I'm conveying, and a lot of times it's hard to do that on social media just for the reasons we were just saying, so yeah.
Yeah, you're talking to a chronic overwriter.
I can relate.
Yeah, I it does get very difficult to have these complex conversations. It's one of the reasons I like I'm on your Substack now, but your old blog, and then, and your writing, because you really do tease out these ideas, uh, in a way that is very
Mhm.
digestible. Um, and, Whipping Girl has now been called kind of the one of the canonical text in trans readings, so I'll make sure the readers have access to that. I do wanna respect your time, so before we go, 2 things. What are you currently grateful for?
Um, I mean, I'm currently grateful for the people who are actually in my life and, um, thinking about kind of them and that community and those relationships rather than not thinking about kind of what a particular presidential administration thinks of me. Um, yeah, I mean, a lot of that, the people in my life are um, keeping me connected and, you know, it's a very stressful time. And so I won't say that everything is fine and I'm doing fine, but that keeps me
Mhm.
balanced and keeps me together in a lot of ways.
That's wonderful. And if our listeners want to find you, buy your readings, support your Substacks, support your Patreon, plug all the things.
Okay, sure, yeah. So on almost every platform that I'm on. I'm Julius Serano, one word and one R in Serano. So my website is juliusserano.com. I'm on a bunch of social media platforms. The one that I'm on the most these days is Blue Sky, so that's at juliusserano.bluesky.social. I'm writing I'm currently publishing essays, the same essay cross-posted on both Substack and Medium, so whichever of those 2 sites you prefer. I've been lately doing, video essays on YouTube, and so that's also Julia Serrano. And my Patreon, if you wanna support my work, or even just keep informed about my work, you can do that, and that's patreon.com/Julia Serrano, so yeah, basically that just if you know my name, you can find me places.
Excellent. We'll have all of those links and more, and links to all of your books. I want to encourage my listeners to read your works because they are phenomenal and thoughtful and in depth in a way you're not going to get in most writings, and will give you insight. And I also want to encourage, like I do at the end of a lot of podcasts, please request your library buy these books so that we get books about trans and queer people on the shelves. If you happen to be local to me in Nevada County, we have the Zip Book program, which is you can look up a book if it is not there but has been published since 2004. You can put in a request, they will order it and send it to you directly. Then you return it to the library and it goes into circulation. So let's get as many queer books into circulation as possible. Thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a real honor to speak with you.
Yeah, thank you, and it was great having this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Texas of the world. Thank you for listening to this episode of Fat Chicks on Top. Please like, subscribe, and review our podcast on whatever platform you listen to it on. If we like your review, we may even read it online. This has been an Auntie Vice production. Producer and host, Rebecca Blanton. Audio production by Sharon Smith. Music by David Manga. And more music by Sharon Smith. For more information about Fat Chicks on Top, please visit our website for all things Fat Chicks at fatchicksontop.com.